When people think about the Second World War in the Balkans, they often remember the fierce resistance that tied down thousands of German troops. But that resistance didn't appear overnight. It was born from an occupation so brutal that before long, ordinary civilians would become targets of German military policy. To understand how an entire city could become the victim of one of the deadliest reprisals in occupied Europe, we have to begin in the spring of 1941. At the time, Yugoslavia was trying to avoid becoming another battlefield. Its government had reluctantly joined the Tripartite Pact, hoping neutrality would spare the country from war. But the agreement lasted only 2 days. A military coup in Belgrade overthrew the pro-Axis government, sending a clear message that Yugoslavia would not quietly submit to German influence. To Adolf Hitler, that wasn't just a political setback, it was an act of defiance. Determined to make an example of Yugoslavia, he ordered an immediate invasion. Before dawn on the 6th of April, 1941, German bombers filled the skies over Belgrade. Without a formal declaration of war, wave after wave of aircraft struck the capital, destroying military positions, government buildings, homes, and vital infrastructure. As smoke rose over the city, Axis armies attacked from every direction. The campaign was devastatingly quick. Within just 11 days, the Yugoslav army had collapsed, and the country surrendered. At first, it seemed Germany had achieved another effortless victory. But occupying a country is very different from conquering it. Much of Serbia came under direct German military administration, where maintaining order quickly became the occupiers' greatest challenge. Resistance movements began to emerge across the countryside, but they were far from united. The royalist Chetniks, led by Draža Mihailović, hoped to restore the Yugoslav monarchy. The communist partisans, under Josip Broz Tito, fought for an entirely different vision of Yugoslavia. Though divided by ideology, both groups launched attacks against German forces. You might expect the German response to focus on hunting down the resistance. Instead, they chose something far more ruthless. The occupation authorities believed the quickest way to crush an uprising was not by targeting the fighters themselves, but by terrorizing the civilians who might support them. Villages were burned, hostages were taken, and a chilling policy was introduced. For every German soldier killed, dozens of innocent civilians would pay with their lives. It was a strategy built on fear. And before long, one battle near the Serbian city of Kraljelvo would put that policy into horrifying action. By the autumn of 1941, Germany's occupation of Serbia was becoming far more difficult than its commanders had expected. Despite the swift victory just months earlier, resistance attacks were increasing across the country. Railways were sabotaged, supply lines were disrupted, and German patrols found themselves under constant threat from both the partisans and the Chetniks. It was no longer a question of whether the resistance existed. The question was how the Germans intended to stop it. That answer came near the industrial city of Kraljevo. In early October 1941, partisan and Chetnik forces launched a joint assault on the German garrison there. For several days, fierce fighting surrounded the city. Although the attackers failed to capture Kraljevo, they inflicted casualties on the occupying forces and exposed a reality the Germans could no longer ignore. The occupation was not secure. For the German High Command, every soldier lost to guerrilla warfare demanded a response, but not the kind you might expect. The commander responsible for occupied Serbia, General Franz Böhme, had already received clear instructions. German occupation policy called for brutal reprisals. For every German soldier killed, 100 hostages were to be executed. For every soldier wounded, 50 more would die. The policy was not intended to deliver justice. It was designed to spread fear so completely that resistance would become unthinkable. After the fighting around Kraljevo, Böhme ordered those reprisals to begin. German troops, assisted by local collaborators, moved through the city carrying out mass arrests. Factory workers were taken from their jobs. Teachers, railway employees, shopkeepers, students, and ordinary laborers were rounded up with little regard for whether they had taken part in the fighting. For many families, there was no warning. One moment, their loved ones were at work or walking home. The next, they had disappeared behind barbed wire. You might be wondering whether the Germans were searching for the people responsible for the attack. In reality, that was never the objective. The victims were chosen because they were available, not because they were guilty. With thousands of civilians now imprisoned, the machinery of reprisal was in motion. Over the next 4 days, the fields outside Kraljelvo would become the scene of one of the deadliest massacres carried out by the German army in occupied Yugoslavia. In the early hours of the 15th of October, 1941, the prisoners were led from makeshift detention sites in groups. Few knew where they were going. Some believed they were being transferred for forced labor. Others sensed the truth only when they arrived at open fields on the outskirts of Kraljelvo. There, the German plan unfolded with chilling precision. The executions were carried out by soldiers of the 717th Infantry Division, assisted by other occupation units. Prisoners were lined up in groups, marched to prepared killing grounds, and shot with rifle and machine gun fire. As one group fell, another was brought forward. Then another, and another. For 4 days, the killing barely stopped. What makes this massacre especially disturbing is how ordinary the victims were. They were not selected because they had fired upon German troops. Among them were factory workers, railway employees, craftsmen, teachers, students, and even teenagers. Many had no connection whatsoever to the resistance. Their deaths were meant to send a message. The German command believed that by inflicting overwhelming punishment on innocent civilians, it could force the population to turn against the partisans and Chetniks. On paper, it was a policy of deterrence. In reality, it became an act of mass murder. By the time the executions ended, historians estimate that more than 2,000 civilians had been killed, making Kraljelvo one of the deadliest German reprisals in occupied Yugoslavia. The violence did not end at the execution sites. Nearby communities suffered arrests, intimidation, and destruction as German forces expanded their campaign against anyone suspected of helping the resistance. Fear spread rapidly across the region, exactly as the occupation authorities intended. Yet something unexpected happened. Instead of crushing the resistance, the massacre strengthened it. News of the executions spread throughout Serbia. For many who had remained on the sidelines, Kraljelvo became proof that cooperation offered no guarantee of safety. The brutality that was meant to restore order instead convinced more people that resistance was the only remaining choice. Even more disturbing, those responsible were not condemned by their superiors. Many officers involved in anti-partisan operations were praised for carrying out their orders, reinforcing a system in which mass reprisals were treated not as crimes, but as military policy. The massacre at Kraljelvo was over, but its consequences were only beginning. As the war drew to a close, the men who had planned and authorized these killings would eventually face a different kind of reckoning, one not on the battlefield, but in the courtroom. When the Second World War finally ended, the killing at Kraljelvo could no longer be dismissed as just another military operation. It had become evidence. As investigators uncovered what had happened across occupied Europe, Germany's policy of executing civilians in retaliation for resistance attacks came under intense scrutiny. The massacres at Kraljelvo and Kragujevac exposed a harsh reality. These were not isolated acts of cruelty, but part of a deliberate occupation strategy approved at the highest levels. You might be wondering whether those responsible were ever held accountable. Some were. Others never faced justice. Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel, who had signed directives authorizing brutal reprisal policies, was tried at the Nuremberg trials. Found guilty of war crimes and crimes against humanity, he was executed in 1946. Field Marshal Wilhelm List, who commanded German forces in the Balkans during the occupation, was also convicted. Although he received a prison sentence, he was released early because of ill health. The fate of General Franz Bohm, the man who oversaw the reprisals in Serbia, was different. Arrested after the war and awaiting trial, he took his own life in prison before the proceedings could begin. The 717th Infantry Division, whose soldiers carried out the executions, did not survive the war as a distinct formation. It was later reorganized and continued fighting on other fronts as Germany's military situation steadily collapsed. Yet the story of Kraljevo did not end with the defeat of Nazi Germany. Today, memorials stand where thousands of innocent people lost their lives. They serve as a reminder that behind every statistic were fathers, mothers, workers, students, and children whose lives were cut short. Perhaps that is Kraljevo's most enduring lesson. At Kraljevo, those choices turned ordinary civilians into targets, leaving behind a legacy that still echoes more than 8 decades later. If you enjoyed this documentary, consider subscribing to the channel for more stories from the Second World War. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.